A challenging climate, strange days, unprecedented times. However we choose to describe it, there is no doubt that the coronavirus has brought upheaval and disruption to global society on a level that many of us have never experienced before. While there's much talk of the pandemic being a great leveller due to its holistic impact on day-to-day life, the truth is far more complex, with individuals, businesses and organisations feeling the effects of the coronavirus in a variety of different ways. The new normal aims to give these people an opportunity to tell their stories, assess the potential impacts of the pandemic on their lives and careers, as well as exploring the challenges and opportunities that have arisen from this era-defining situation. Each week, myself, Chris Webb and Helen Armitage from the Careers and Employability Service at Sheffield Hallam University will be joined by a different guest from the world of industry, educational careers, with opportunities for listeners to put their questions forward in advance of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in and joining us as we explore what the new normal means for all of us on a local, national and global scale. Good morning and welcome to episode 11 of The New Normal. I'm joined as always by my co-host Helen Armitage. Helen, how are you doing today?
Very well today, thanks Chris. Yeah, very well. Sunny outside, so yeah, all good. How about you? Sunny outside,
sunny inside on the virtual background as well.
Sunshine everywhere.
Keeping it consistent. Not doing too badly myself. I think it's we're starting to get into, aren't we, a bit more of a routine at the moment. So it's starting to feel, dare I say it, a genuine new normal. And we're very, very happy to be joined today by one of our Sheffield Hallam University alumni, Ian Middleton. Ian recently retired as Managing Director of Smith Young, who were involved in a number of the biggest retail developments in Europe. Ian, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much for joining us, Ian. So we like to kick off the podcast with a bit of a good news story, our gloom busters for the week, to try and inject a little bit of positivity into what's going on at the moment. So Helen, have you got any good news stories you'd like to share with us this week?
Yeah, mine is kind of a personal story. It's kind of about connections, really, in between myself and industry professionals. So this week, I shared an article that was written by Pip Jameson, who is founder of The Dots, and Lucy Painter, who is founder of Studio, which is an interior design recruitment consultancy in the South. Share this article that they've both written for Design Week on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Lucy Painter then got in touch with me via LinkedIn and said, great to connect with you. I've written a book called In With the Interior Design Crowd, which is basically a Bible for students and graduates that are hoping to progress within the interior design sector. And Lucy said, would you like me to send you a copy? It'd be great for you to promote to your students. So I said, yes, by all means, please send me a copy. This sounds perfect. She has sent me the copy. It's here now. I'm holding it for Chris and Ian that can see this. And it's a brilliant book. It's absolutely amazing. And I've started to promote it with our students and graduates and other HE careers professionals that are working with students wanting to get into interior design. But it's such a brilliant book, and it was so nice of Lucy to send me this. And it just shows, I think, how we are connecting within this current climate where it feels, we're kind of disbanded, but we're also coming together through online platforms, and those connections between HE professionals, students and graduates and industry are still there, alive and well. But yeah, brilliant book. And again, thank you for Lucy if you're listening.
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. And I think, Penny Lee, I think, was mentioning a few weeks back on the podcast actually about being perhaps easier to connect with people than it has been before. You meet people through a webinar and actually, people may be more accessible. So I think that's great to hear. Ian, any good news stories you'd like to share with us this week?
Well, it's got to be COVID related because that's all the news at the moment. And the news is that the pubs and the restaurants look likely to open rather sooner than we'd expected. So that's good news. And for the younger generation, although maybe some of the older ones as well, McDonald's are reintroducing deliveries.
Yeah, I've seen the adverts. I think, we're guaranteed a high uptake there, aren't we? So, and I suppose it plays back this idea of, as long as people are keeping safe, it's getting to some sort of new normality. So, I think that's definitely reason for some people to be kind of positive and optimistic. And a final good news story from me for this week, a little bit more down the line of sort of education and work, actually. The Careers and Enterprise Company, along with a number of partners, including Oak Academy, LiveLearn, various employers, including Burberry, BAE, NHS Trusts, and a number of careers leaders across the country have kind of banded together to create this My Week of Work virtual
sort of work experience as a bit of a substitute really for kind of year 10 or year 9 students who've maybe missed out on work experience because of when the pandemic hit. With most work experience typically being around sort of June, July time for a lot of schools. So I think, it's great to see sort of innovative ways of, I guess, bringing that experience into the classroom. And although it's never quite going to replicate it, there's a lot of kind of live video chats with employers, lots of challenges for kind of schools to do, teachers to do in their classes, even if students are learning remotely as they are at the moment. So I think, great to see those sort of different methods coming in, and refreshing, I think, to see that even in a time where we can't kind of do the physical stuff, we're at least thinking of how we can run things differently. So positive one from me for this week too.
Absolutely. Okay then, Ian, we'll make a start. So if you can just kind of kick us off with just a brief overview about how COVID-19 has impacted your life, both professionally and personally.
Have I adapted? Well, I retired last May, so I was really looking for a new normal. I knew I had to slow down. There's less to do. I didn't have to worry about clients or all the other demands on life. My kids had left home. So it was, well, what's next? And then this came along. And so it's a bit like, well, let's retreat indoors. Let's continue to think about what I'm going to do. Let's get the travel plans sorted, ready for when we can travel again. And keep calm, get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I suppose there's never a good time for a pandemic to come along, but as you've said, it's, I guess, impacted you slightly less than it would have done otherwise. Correct. So, and interesting to hear, I guess, from your previous experience, how it might have been had you still been in work. So, thank you again for joining us today. And I mean, this is kind of the first of what we're hoping is in a series of interviews really with Sheffield Hallam University alumni who've gone on to do all sorts of wonderful things since graduating at various different times. And so I suppose kind of the first thing really for any of our listeners will just be to find out a little bit more about your career and how you've kind of got to the position you are before you retired, and sort of what that's been like for you. So would you mind telling us just a little bit more about your career to date and some of the projects you've been involved in, particularly within Sheffield City region?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I was at Hallam 1975 to 1979, which will seem a long time ago to a lot of the listeners. It's a long time ago for me. I knew at a reasonably early stage that I wanted to go into property, have property as a career, so that was a bit of an advantage. I had an uncle who was an estate agent, so I used to listen to what he'd got to say, and I was fairly convinced property was the right thing to do for me, although because I like geography and maths, I didn't want to decide at an early stage which sector to go into. In the year out, I went to British Rail Property Board in Bristol, and the reason I went there was they were paying pretty well. They had a really interesting portfolio. The railway estate is a really interesting estate with lots of different kinds of property, commercial property, and a lot of property that needs adapting and bringing up to date. And I could see that in those days. Loved my year out, came back to Poly, and then decided, Hallam as it now is, and then decided, all right, let's get this last year out of the way, get my degree. And it was a fairly standard degree, 2-2 in those days. It wasn't a startling success, but I got a couple of job offers. I thought I'd stay in Yorkshire. Quite a few went down to London, and that was always the route for a large number of graduates, go down to London. And in some ways, that's probably one of the only things I haven't done, which I think that might have been quite fun. But anyway, I joined Sheffield City Council Estates Department. In my year, after the years out, some of the students would come back and they'd tell us, oh yes, I was in a small private practice firm, and they had to make tea and do all sorts of menial tasks and polish the furniture, and they seemed to concentrate on the bad experiences. So I got a fairly bad impression of early life in a small commercial practice. So I decided, no, I'd go for a bigger organisation because I knew I'd have a better chance, or I felt I'd have a better chance getting my professional qualifications. Job came up with Sheffield Council. That's a big council in a big city with a big budget, and they were having to face a bit of an economic downturn following the crisis in 73, 74, and things were fairly bad, but it meant they'd got things to do, and the industry needed refreshing, so they were busy buying up old industrial premises, and we got shops, and there were suburban shops and city centre shops and all sorts of things. So I had a great experience there. Even bought the lead mill for the city council at the time. I don't suppose the lead mill's owned by the council anymore, but that was a very interesting exercise. But there were some great big projects there, and I really enjoyed that. But I realised, having got my qualifications, if we're going to succeed, I needed to move on. And I could see the council as a job getting too political. There was lots of councillor interventions, which got a bit intensive at times. So I thought, I'm going to move away from this. I want to go to private practice. And the job came up in Leeds. And what you find in Sheffield is the better jobs tend to be in Leeds, in surveying. And so I got a job with GUS Property Management. So I moved, they're a subsidiary of Great Universal Stores, a major retailer of the 50s and 60s. And they had a very big investment portfolio, shops that they no longer require and let out to people like, well, eventually Next, but they tended to have the best shops in town. So on Fargate, was Cavendish Woodhouse, which was a furniture retailer. So you got prime pitch, and yet you've got a furniture retailer in it. Well, it became Top Shop, Top Man, and they paid the biggest rent ever for that shop. And there were subsequent rent reviews, but it never went up. They just paid what it took to take it. And GUS had properties like that all over the country. But it was an organisation that there was quite a bit of management by terror. We would have mail meetings in the morning where letters would come in. The managing director would read them before we even saw them, and then question us on them. And all the directors and the surveyors would be sat there cowering in front of the MD. You'd never get away from it now. But it was a fantastic experience for knowing your portfolio, doing a thorough job, and just trying not to be caught out, really. I don't advocate it as a management style, but it's fascinating for a while to be on the receiving end of it. If you last, some people clearly didn't last, which was unfortunate, but I look back at it with great affection, as do a couple of other very senior surveyors in London who were also involved with it at that time. But it did get a bit stressful, and eventually I decided, well, retail, they had industrial office and retail premises, and I thought retail was definitely the most interesting of the commercial sectors. I'd already discounted residential. There's too much emotion involved in that. Needed to be commercial. And of the commercial sectors, I thought retail was the most dynamic and the one for me. And fortunately, perhaps, a job came up with the Burton Group in Leeds, whose estates department, management department, are based in Leeds, and not any longer. They moved down to London, and I got a job there as a surveyor, dealing with all the Burton shops in an area north of Birmingham, going right up to Inverness, really, on the eastern side of the country. And again, that was brilliant. Everybody, all the surveyors in London wanted to know the Burton Group, because the Burton Group gave out instructions for acquisitions and disposals. We had a great time. It was incredibly sociable. Property is a very sociable business, or it has been in my experience, really sociable. There are jobs in property where you don't need to be sociable, and some people aren't sociable. They can find jobs in things maybe like valuations or the more esoteric things that go on in property. But I like that agency sort of contact, building networks, and the Burton Group was absolutely ideal for me. And in that job, I would do rent reviews and lease renewals, landlord and tenant work on the high street shops, the Burton Group, which is Top Shop, Dorothy Perkins, Evans, a number of brands. In fact, there were about 10 or 11 different brands at the height of their power in about 1990. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. A job came up to work within the Burton Group for Debenhams department store, work in that section. And I decided I didn't want it. They wanted me to do it, and I didn't want to do it because I thought working for Debenhams would sideline me into a bit of a too specialist area. And but they thought I'd be good for the job because they already liked what I was doing. But I decided I had to put my foot down and carefully say I really didn't want to do that, and have to accept that the job I really wanted in the organisation was being given to somebody else at the same time. So a bit of a double whammy. But again, one of those lessons is these things happen, get on with it, get over it, and things will just stick to the task and you'll be fine. So they understood why I didn't want to go there. I continued to work for the Burton Group, and then in 1993, Smith Young, I was going to a meeting at Meadowhall. Meadowhall was in my patch, and I'd been following it since before it opened, because we'd acquired shops in the shopping centre. So it opened and life was going on. But Burton Group had acquired far too much space. I could see the rent reviews coming up in 1995 were going to be a major problem. The rents were going to rocket. We'd have to get out of some space. But the landlord was also going through a tricky time as well, because 1990 recession, they'd found it difficult to let up to begin with. And you look back now, you wonder why was there ever any doubt over it? But there were doubts about it in the 90s, whether it would succeed or not. Difficult to conceive that now. But I went down there for a meeting about this, and we'd agreed a deal. But then they, right out of the blue, they offered me a job. So come and work for us. Come and come and leave Burton Group. Come and take charge of the rent reviews for the landlord. Well, I'd been a tenant all along, so I had to go and think about it. And as these things never come up at the right time, my wife was about to have our second child. I went home, mother-in-law's there. They asked me how I got on at my meeting, and I quickly told them they'd offered me a job, and was quickly told, you don't want to be changing your job at this time of life. And I said, yeah, that's what I told them, because I was thinking, I really wanted this job. I think I wanted the job. And I just had to negotiate and play it cool. So to cut a long story short, I got that job. We did the September 95 rent reviews, which went very successfully. And arising out of that, we then had a succession of situations where Meadowhall was successful. Therefore, other people looked at what we'd done. And it was the first of the big schemes to have reviews like that. Bluewater was the first to come along, which is a big shopping centre in Kent, for those of you who don't know that. And that's if we get involved. And so needless to say, I said yes. We didn't even have to pitch for that. They just liked what we did, and they liked the way we did it. They talked to us on and off in social dues before. So I said, yes, we do that. And at the same time, because they were built in a similar period, Trafford came along and said, well, will you come and work on our big stores for us? And I told them I'd got this Bluewater instruction, but yeah, we could fit that one in. And so that continued. And those two clients, Lend-Lease on Bluewater and Peel on Trafford, then gave us more work, particularly Lend-Lease, who put us on another one of their schemes. And when that was, and Hammerson came along and said, would you be interested in working on West Quay in Southampton? And I told them, I'd love to work on that one. That's an interesting scheme, but we didn't have the resources and just the wrong time. And they thanked me for being so honest and frank with them. That was always our approach. We wouldn't take on a job unless we knew we could deal with it. No point over-promising and under-delivering. So they said, well, we like your frankness. We'll come back to you probably in the future at some point. And we went away, and they did come back, and we then got 3 instructions, one after another from them on Bullring, Southampton and Reading. And then in 2006, Westfield came along and said they liked what we were doing. They'd like us to consider working with them on Westfield London, which we did, the first round of rent reviews there. And you're talking vast numbers on those big schemes. You've got rent rolls in excess of 100 million a year, capital value is 2 billion a year, although that's changing at the moment. And so we worked on that. That went really well. That then led to Westfield Stratford, the reviews there in 2016. And then I retired. That's another story, but another interesting one. Why and when do you retire? There's several reasons for that, but that's not one here to talk about today. And that, in a nutshell, is how my career developed.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And I mean, I think, everyone listening to that will see that there's, I suppose, so many different things that you've been able to unpick there in terms of why you had to make decisions at particular points. But I think also, not just from a careers perspective, but in terms of, I guess, the actual sector itself, a lot of stuff in there that people may not be aware of, which I think we're going to touch on in a later question. So, thanks so much for your reflections there.
Yeah, really interesting to hear, Ian. I love hearing people's career journeys and how they've moved from one role to the next. And I think you perfectly articulated there how with an incredible amount of hard work and doing a really good job, your reputation in the work you were doing, it just led on to more work coming from it. And I think that it's just absolutely brilliant here. I'm so captivated by that story. And like you say, the huge projects that you've worked on, I find absolutely, brilliant. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's really interesting.
I think, Helen, one of the things we've been particularly, as a firm, been proud of is that we're really only just 12 of us. So we were competing against all the major global firms. So not CBRE, because we worked with them. But the clients felt we had a great working relationship with CBRE. Sometimes you find joint agents are competing with each other and scoring points a bit off. But for us, the clients always knew that we were totally independent. They probably liked the fact they'd got a real hold on us, which they probably don't have over CBRE, although some of these big clients would suggest somebody like Land Securities or Westfield would think, we can actually push these very, very big agents around, and we'll do that. But the small ones, that was never part of the conversation. Yeah. And in 2005, it was because of our work on these schemes, we won the Property Week Professional Agency Team of the Year. And the judges politely described us as the leading rent review surveyors on regional shopping centres, which I really, really rather liked. And it said that we'd made ourselves leading players against competition from all the major agents. So for a firm of just 12 people, that was brilliant. Very, very satisfying.
what's great is even after such a long career, Ian, you really still seem so passionate about it, which I think is kind of all of us would probably hope for our own careers throughout and towards the end. So
very important quality, I think, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can come on to that later as well.
So, as you've mentioned there, that you have recently retired, and you've had a very long and prestigious career. So I'm just curious to find out about your connections that are still working within the sector, and what have their reflections been on the COVID-19 pandemic, and how has this impacted on professionals working within the area and the future of the sector going forward?
Right, so the COVID crisis was pretty much unprecedented, and they're talking about events, 1 in 300 year events, and clearly nobody remembers that far back. But it's not the first time we've had a major economic shock. So in my career, we've had the early 80s economic restructuring of the country. That was all about loss of impetus in the economy and loss of confidence and loss of jobs. The early 90s was the same. In 2008, we had the Lehman's crisis, which was a massive financial crisis where inflated values and over-optimism, suddenly people woke up the fact it was all a bit built on sand, and it came crashing down. And you saw at that time similar drops in the value of stocks, 25% down. A lot of similar consequences in those days, but this one is quite different. And this is a massive, accelerating a massive structural change in the business world, which the 2008 one probably started a bit, but this is completely different because everybody didn't stay at home for 3 months. This has been incredible. Unfortunately, a lot of the organisations that we dealt with have prepared for not this, but working remotely. So if you're dealing on big shopping centres, you need to have all businesses need a business continuity plan. But if you've got a big shopping centre, you're very mindful of the fact that trouble could happen, could flood, as in the case of Meadowhall. You need to have plans in place for dealing with things like that. These events come along with no notice whatsoever, a bit like this one. So I think all the organisations that I've spoken with had well advanced plans, and Smith Young the same. They'd moved to cloud-based computing systems, so all their data is stored remotely. It's not in a bunch of files at Meadowhall. It's up in the clouds. So they were quickly able to switch over to that. And with the advent of Zoom's the one everybody talks about. I was reading their usage has gone up 30-fold since this started. They've now got 300 million users, which is just incredible. So everybody seems to have adapted to Zoom, and I think it's in Microsoft Teams. There are various other platforms like this. And in our kind of business, face-to-face contact is very, very important, but you can manage for a while without it. And if you're all in the same boat and you have no alternative, that's going to work. The problem is going to be how we come back from it, because it seemed to be very easy just to switch everything off, put it into a coma. It's how you bring it out of that, as we're seeing with all the other aspects of the economy, and how, with a London-centric business, firms nervous about bringing people into their businesses, infecting their staff, how are they going to deal with that? And they're going to be overcautious. So I suspect clients will not encourage face-to-face meetings. They'll want to carry on this for a while. But there's going to be some big challenges. Negotiations, which is a large part of what we do, over a screen really don't work at all the same way as face-to-face. And this whole thing, I said before, surveying is a really social profession. People like to get together. It's not like, in my experience, the lawyers or the accountants who all see themselves as being in competition. So hide away from each other and only meet each other in adversarial situations. We landlords representatives meet tenants representatives, and we get on really well. I'm still big friends with lots of tenant representatives, and we have Zoom calls and they talk to me about what's going on. But I think there's just complete uncertainty as to how that's going to pan out over what period of time. And of course, you've got the commute and things. And what I'd recommend people do, have a look at the RICS website. I don't normally refer people to it, but there's some great stuff on there about the precautions they're encouraging businesses to take to come back to work. And it's interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because they see themselves as a global property organisation, representative body. Therefore, they're looking at it from a global perspective. How's it going to work across the world? Their advice is aimed to appeal to a global market. So it must be some of the best advice. They will have taken a lot of soundings, and well worth read.
It's really, really interesting, Ian. I mean, I think, you know, as you've said there, it's obviously the pandemic is quite different to sort of situations we've had in the past. But actually, very kindly, sort of previously, you shared with us a presentation that yourself and Smith Young did to Sheffield Hallam University, or did for Sheffield Hallam University, I should say, in 2009. And you mentioned sort of following the global recession, you know, that there were quite a lot of challenges that we're still sort of seeing now. So you mentioned about the growth of e-commerce, reduced consumer confidence following a period of economic uncertainty, and issues around sustainability as well. And I suppose sort of just leading on from the point that you've just made, are there any sort of lessons you think the sector is likely to take on board from previous economic crises? Or do you feel that this is perhaps, as you said, something unprecedented that maybe there isn't that roadmap for?
I think the consequence of this pandemic are really an acceleration of the trends that we talked about 10 years ago, and you could have talked about 20 years ago. For many years, in our rent review work, because we act on the biggest centres, we've talked about the polarisation of retail towards the big centres. And you look at the drift of sales towards the big shopping centres. Places like Westfield, London and Westfield, Stratford, their sales are over £1 billion a year. They're taking a lot of retail spend. And this has always been one of the issues for Sheffield and Meadowhall, which we had to contend with in the past, is that it's competing with city centre. The counter to that is, well, if you didn't have it, is there any guarantee that Sheffield will be different? It's a very complicated argument, and each town and city has got its own particular circumstances. The challenges that were appearing 10 years ago are now going to be magnified. Internet clearly is getting more and more of a challenge for bricks and mortar retailers. But I think most people say, 80% of retail sales touch a physical property. So there's a big future for physical property for retailing. It's just what's it look like and where's it going to be? And if they don't build any more out-of-town shopping centres, it's going to happen in town centres. It's going to have to adapt. And it's going to have to adapt quite quickly, because there's going to be people sat there on empty properties paying taxes they just need to do something about. Previously, 2008, most investors just sat tight and thought, well, we just need to sort the banks out and the liquidity in the economy, and then it'll go back to normal. And it did a bit. There was a lot of talk about move to turnover rents. In fact, I was asked to go and talk to a conference in Ireland, in Dublin. It's the only time I've been there. But they said, oh, come and talk to us about turnover rent leasing, because you've been involved in a lot of that. And I went there and said, yeah, turnover rent leasing, it's a mechanism whereby retail sales determine what the rent's going to be, the relationship between a fixed percentage of turnover or a variable percentage and your sales. So the two are connected. And historically, it's just been a response to bad times. It was that in America when they built too much space. It started in America, they built too much space, and that was a way of dealing with it, saying don't pay us $100,000 a year, just pay us 10% of whatever turnover you do. The idea has been adapted here, and each time a crisis comes along, it gets talked about a lot. It got talked about a lot in 2009, 2010. And as I say, I was being asked to go and talk at conferences about it. But now it's appearing in the papers again and again and again. And I think what's different this time is so many retailers in the last 5 years have failed and gone away. Where are the new retailers coming in? The new retailers coming in are going to require more flexible terms. We've seen leases getting shorter. Well, they're going to get much shorter. They're going to get much shorter, and that brings into play a whole new set of requirements. Landlords are going to need to be more aggressive. Well, not aggressive. They're going to need to be more intelligent in their management of the centre and work probably more closely with the retailers. The retailers are going to need to decide why do they really need a shop? Do they need a shop? To what extent can they deal with their business on the internet? Not having the internet is a major problem for those. Primark, for example, are sat on hundreds of millions of pounds worth of stock, losing fortunes in turnover. And you wonder whether, because they're working on very low margins, how's that going to come out of the recession? Because there are all sorts of other sorts of cost pressures on them. And if they haven't got the internet, they may have to start trimming their portfolio. And it's about right-sizing that kind of approach to an omni-channel, they call it omni-channel approach to retailing. It's speeding all that up. Same things, as you mentioned, at a faster pace.
Really interesting. I find this topic so interesting, and it's like you mentioned there about Primark and how they're not operating online yet, and how they're possibly missing out, and how retailers need to be working with people like yourselves to manage their way through this crisis. I find it a really interesting side of the retail industry, and it's kind of, I think, seen by a lot of people as the in the dark, kind of behind the curtains part of the sector, and it's maybe not as widely known to a lot of students and graduates and other professionals. So just going on to the second topic there is to just ask, from your experience, what are some of the benefits and challenges of working in this area, and how can students, graduates and other professionals listening to this podcast today find out a little bit more about getting into this sector if that's interested in what they're wanting to progress into?
Right, well, the area in which I work is what we would call retail asset management. So you've got a big retail asset and you're going to manage it. It's an investment, it's a commodity, and you need to manage it. And there's loads of different aspects to that. I looked for a reasonable definition of this, and in doing so I thought the best place to have a look at is CBRE, who I mentioned earlier, who are the world's leading, they call themselves the world's leading full service real estate and investment organisation. They've listed what they think retail asset management involves. So there's property management, which is looking after buildings and maintenance. There's development services, so managing projects if you're going to add something to a building, concept and design work, marketing and feasibility studies. You've then got retail leasing, which is letting the shops. You've got lease consultancy, which is what I did, which is rent reviews, 1954 Act, landlord and tenant renewals and terminations. You've then got all the finance management and accounting side to it. Client reporting, which we all have to do, operations and risk management. So operations, shopping centres don't run themselves. That's a massive operation. Marketing, research, another really interesting, retail trends and customer insight. That's with all the data collection now and all this big data stuff, that's increasingly important. And a bit like some of the supermarkets, they're at that stage where they're gathering so much data now. It's just going to be a question, how do they use it and who uses it the best? Information technology, retail design and project management, the list goes on. But it's the fact all of those have to work in sync. So the leasing has to have regard to the planning and the development, and the rent reviews and the lease renewals have to have regard to how much space there is and what shape it is, and do we need to adapt it. And some people are suggesting that on some of these big centres, as much as 30% of the space might need to be repositioned. On the basis that there's so much retail there, maybe there's too much, you need to create space, other attractions, other reasons to go. Places like Meadowhall and Trafford, fantastic, there'll always be fantastic locations, easy to get to, lots of free car parking. You just need to make sure that they stay in tune with what the customers want. And they've done that very, very successfully. I'm sure they'll continue to do so for many years to come. So I would say it's big picture, there's lots of big picture stuff, but it's all made up of, it's like a massive jigsaw. Lots of little bits, lots of pieces, all need to be working in harmony. And it's very sociable. The only caveat I've got is there's not that much of it on big shopping centres because there's only a few. And Smith Young managed to dominate quite a lot of aspects of certainly the landlord and tenant side of things, as we said a bit earlier. So, but I think going forward, it's really interesting stuff to be getting involved with. Is companies that are doing these mixed use developments. So housing, you know, they're talking about city centres having to change, more housing being brought in, more office workspace. And in London particularly, there are these great big estates, the Shaftesbury estate, Covent Garden, places like this, where they've got big, massive chunks of land and buildings, and they're busy sort of juggling the pieces and keeping them relevant. That must be fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's really interesting. And, you know, this is exactly the sort of, I suppose, kind of relevant live labour market information we sort of talk to students and graduates about, and say, you know, this is why kind of reaching out and making those connections, I think, as was alluded to earlier, is so important. Because, you know, I think as you and I have had that conversation about, you know, you reach out to people and you start to gain these kind of commercial insights that perhaps you don't simply find through a website or through sort of news articles. Although, as you mentioned there, a lot of stuff that people might have listened to there that they'll maybe recognise as happening in their own areas, particularly around, as you said, those kind of mixed commercial estates. Things like West Bar, where they've got accommodation and kind of commercial outlets coming in as well. So yeah, really, really interesting to hear that. And I think perhaps gives people a little bit more of an indication that within an industry that we think we maybe know quite well. Actually, there's an awful lot to it in terms of the number of jobs available and the different sectors that it kind of touches upon. I suppose finally, the question I guess we sort of wanted to ask you and feel we should ask you as a Sheffield Hallam graduate is to kind of return to that idea of careers advice itself. And you've already given us some really kind of insights and reflections about your career journey. But I suppose the last question we had, from the perspective of maybe a current Sheffield Hallam undergraduate or graduate, are there any sort of particular nuggets of careers advice or information you'd like to share with them, either from the perspective of the sector that you worked in, or just more generally in terms of any lessons you learned along the way?
Well, Chris, I think people might think I had this really clever plan at the start. I didn't have a really clever plan. I just worked at it as I went along. But if you have a plan, that's helpful. In our firm, I always thought there are certain qualities I wanted to write down, because as I approached retirement, I thought, having worked 40 years, there's lots of nuggets and things I've picked up that I ought to try and write down. And I still haven't got there yet. But this podcast has helped me again dust off some of the things I collected and some of the advice I would give people. And I think key is you want to try and be yourself, but it helps if you're enthusiastic and you're curious in a very polite and pleasant kind of way about stuff. Don't just take things for granted. I think that's really, really important. I've always been one for looking for decent quotes from people about like success and ambition and things, but I've never been one of these people who go and read all the books. Although that said, I have got one from the Nike guy, Phil Knight, which I'm really keen to read, because he started with nothing and came up very successfully. And it's not just retailers. One thing at Smith Young that our client Stadium, Eddie Healy, I think was very firmly believed in, was that you just need to look outside the box a bit. Don't look at your sector. Look across a wide spread of activities for things and for guidance. So one I quite like, although it's really close to surveying, you wouldn't think, but the military there's some really interesting military books about planning and strategy and things. And a guy who I saw speak a few years ago has just been in the news for rather more controversial reasons, is Colin Powell, who was a black guy who reached the top of the American military and became Secretary of State in America. Incredible achievement. And two of his recommendations are that perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. So if you go in and you're optimistic and you always think you can get the thing done, it'll rub off on other people and you'll take them with you. You need to take your team with you. And he said also that there's no secret to success. It's preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. Don't be put off by that. So I think those are very, very important lessons. But the one person at the moment who I would most urge you to go and study a little bit is Elon Musk, who must be one of the most interesting guys on the planet. And he's got his 10 rules for success. One is work super hard. Nothing good in life comes without effort. Rule 2, have a good product. You can't expect people to pay for any old garbage. So if we offered bad consultancy advice, they'd soon kick us off and find somebody else. Do something important. Now, that's a bit ambiguous. I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there, but your work has to be important to you and the people that you do. I was very passionate about the work I did, and my clients recognised that and wondered why I would ever retire. And I think they were a bit surprised when I did. Love what you do. Absolutely key. Passion is one of the key motivators in business. If you don't love what you do, you're far less likely to succeed because you won't find the drive to keep pushing things when it gets tough. So that's a really good one. Quality over noise. Make a lot of noise about people who make a lot of noise about something just don't get anywhere if the product's no good. Always rely on quality. It'll always trump marketing as well. Keep pushing. You will experience failure along the way. Take a risk. Don't just stay in your comfort zone or you'll not achieve anything amazing. Ignore negative influences. This is one very close to my heart. People will try to talk you out of what you're doing. Some of those people may even be your family and friends. You'll have to block out that negativity and keep pushing. Best thing you can do here is to spend time with inspiring, positive people. And Clive Woodward, for the rugby followers among you, I read his book, and the key thing I got out of that was about energy sappers. People can sap the energy of others, and if they're in your organisation, they really can be very damaging. Attract great people. Obviously, you want to get a great team, which I thought we did at Smith Young, and look for problem solvers. Those are the people who will grow your business. If you've got a problem, you need to overcome it to get on. So Elon Musk, definitely worth a read about him. And there will be lots of others, but those are my current recommendations.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, and I think, what you mentioned there about the passion and enthusiasm carrying people through, I think everyone listening to this podcast will have easily been able to kind of pick that up, even through the sound waves, in terms of how passionate you've been about your career, which I think... I'll finish with
another one, Chris, which a client said to me, not because he thought I was lying, but he said, never lie, and you never have to remember what you said. You won't get caught out. It's so simple. Lots of this stuff is really, really simple but until you hear it and think about it.
And great advice for a podcast as well. Not worrying about not having to worry about what you might say on a podcast. But I mean, Ian, we've got to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I think, there's really, really useful reflections in there. I think whether for Sheffield Hallam University students and graduates or really anyone else who's listening, particularly in terms of that career journey, as Helen mentioned as well, and perhaps the twists and turns and the lessons sort of learned along the way. So, really, really interesting to hear that. And thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Ian. That's been great.
All right.
If you've been interested in anything that we've talked about on today's podcast, do get in touch with us via the comment threads on the podcast link, wherever you're listening. We'll be tuning in again next week with a guest soon to be announced. And each week when we announce the guest, we'll be giving you a chance to put questions to the special guest in advance of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in and listening to us here on The New Normal.